It was a gray autumn afternoon in Ravenwood Park. The ground was damp from last night's rain, and the air smelled of wet leaves. Officer David Miller walked his usual patrol with Rex, his German Shepherd partner. Suddenly, Rex stopped. His ears went up, his body tense. Then he bolted toward a patch of grass at the far end of the park. David followed quickly as Rex dug furiously at the ground. Within seconds, his paws struck metal with a sharp clang. Pushing aside the dirt, David saw the edge of an old suitcase, rusted and cracked, rising out of the earth. In that moment, he knew this wasn't just lost property. Rex had uncovered the start of a mystery. Would Rex's discovery reveal the truth behind long-forgotten secrets? Hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. Let's continue the story. The city of Ravenwood was never known for kindness in autumn. By late October, the skies hung low, heavy with the weight of approaching winter, the gray clouds pressing down like a lid that sealed the town away from the sun. The air smelled of rain-soaked pavement and wood smoke drifting from chimneys, and the breeze carried a damp chill that found its way under collars and cuffs no matter how tightly people wrapped themselves. The park on the outskirts, Ravenwood Park, sprawled across several acres of grass, woodland, and winding paths, a place meant to be a refuge, though the encroaching season seemed to leach the warmth from even its friendliest corners. Officer David Miller adjusted his jacket as he stepped onto the gravel path, boots crunching softly. At 41, he was a man marked not only by the years, but by what those years had taken from him. His face was lean, the kind that had grown harder with time, with lines etched deeply around his mouth and eyes. His jaw was square, often clenched even when he wasn't angry, and a short, bristly beard peppered with gray shadowed his cheeks. David had served 15 years in the Ravenwood Police Department, long enough to witness the worst of people. Violence born from desperation, greed, and neglect. His colleagues respected his steady composure, though many knew his patience came from a private loss. A younger brother, gone too soon in an accident when David was still a rookie. A grief that had left him quieter, more cautious, and determined never to underestimate danger again. Beside him trotted Rex, his German Shepherd partner. Rex was 5 years old, in the prime of his working life. His coat a blend of black and tan that gleamed even in the muted afternoon light. Weighing nearly 90 pounds, he carried himself with the controlled power of an athlete, muscles rippling under his fur, movements purposeful and precise. His ears stood tall, sharp like radar, and his amber eyes flicked constantly from tree line to bench to passerby, always assessing, never fully at ease. Unlike other patrol dogs, Rex had a serious disposition. He did not wag his tail freely at strangers, nor did he seek affection outside of his handler. He was bred from a line of disciplined working dogs in Pennsylvania, trained to track, to guard, to uncover. But David knew Rex's personality ran deeper than his training. The dog had an intensity, an alertness that seemed almost human, as if every sound or smell carried meaning. Their patrol this afternoon was meant to be routine, just a sweep of the park before the nearby schools dismissed. Parents sat huddled on benches in coats, sipping coffee from paper cups, while toddlers stumbled across the damp playground. Teenagers with earbuds in leaned against trees, absorbed in their music, oblivious to the world. The ground itself was soft from last night's rain, patches of grass pressed flat with muddy footprints. David glanced at the people around, giving a polite nod to a jogger, a tall woman in her late 20s with a thin frame, dark curly hair tied back in a ponytail, and earbuds bouncing as she ran past. She smiled briefly, breath steaming in the cold air, then was gone down the path. A middle-aged man tossed a frisbee to his golden retriever near the pond, his laughter carrying lightly across the water. Everything about the scene spoke of normalcy, the sort of ordinary life David had sworn to protect. But Rex did not share that calm. Without warning, the German shepherd froze. His body stiffened, ears snapping upright, his gaze locked on something invisible to David. A low growl rumbled in his throat. David slowed, hand tightening on the leash. "Easy, boy. What is it?" Rex pulled forward, nose lowered, muscles coiled. Then, with sudden force, he lunged toward the far side of the park, dragging David several steps before he regained his footing. "Rex!" "Hold up." The command rang firm, but the dog's determination was stronger. They reached a patch of thick, unkempt grass near the old maintenance shed, an area most visitors ignored. The shed itself was a crumbling structure of peeling paint and rusted hinges, half swallowed by weeds, left to decay as the park modernized around it. But Rex was uninterested in the shed. Instead, he began to claw at the ground just beside it, powerful paws tearing through damp earth and matted grass. David tugged the leash. "Rex, enough!" he barked, though he crouched to see what had captured the dog's attention. Rex ignored him, digging faster, dirt spraying across the officer's boots. His growls deepened, the sound less aggressive than urgent, almost demanding. Then came the sound, a harsh metallic scrape beneath the soil. David's eyes widened. He leaned down, brushing away mud with his gloved hands. Slowly, from under the roots and earth, the corner of an object began to appear. The surface was metal, its edges cracked and jagged with rust. He cleared more, heart quickening, until the shape revealed itself. An old suitcase, leather rotted, latches corroded. It had not been placed there recently. The earth had pressed against it for years, swallowing it, hiding it until Rex had unearthed it again. David sat back on his heels, staring at the strange discovery. Families laughed and talked only 100 yards away, yet here, at the edge of Ravenwood Park, something forgotten, or perhaps deliberately hidden, had waited in silence for someone to find it. And Rex had. David Miller crouched low in the damp grass, staring at the half-buried suitcase as if it were some relic unearthed from an archaeological dig. The corroded corners and brittle leather straps hinted at decades of neglect, and yet the earth around it seemed disturbed, as though someone had once tried to conceal it hastily. Rex sat beside him, breathing hard, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, his eyes fixed firmly on the object, ears twitching as if every creak of its rusted frame carried meaning. Grunting, David dug his hands deeper into the dirt, tugging at the heavy case until the soil gave way with a wet sigh. The suitcase came free at last, its weight surprising him. It was heavier than it looked, though not because of gold or bricks. The handle crumbled in his grip, the leather rotting into flakes against his gloves. He set it down gently on the grass. Around them, the ordinary world continued. Laughter of children on swings, the distant thump of a basketball against pavement, the hum of passing traffic beyond the park fence. The contrast made the silence between him and Rex feel louder. David's eyes scanned the area out of habit. Not far away, an elderly woman sat feeding pigeons from a paper bag, wrapped in a thick wool coat with a red scarf. Her hair was silver white, cut short against her weathered face. She didn't look toward them. her eyes fixed on the birds, but David noticed her hands trembled slightly as though weakened by age or illness. He doubted she had anything to do with what Rex had found, but still his instincts kept her in the corner of his awareness. He drew a deep breath, steeling himself, and crouched again before the suitcase. With careful pressure, he forced one of the corroded latches open. It resisted, squealing like a scream before snapping loose. The other latch came undone with less protest, and the suitcase creaked open on reluctant hinges. The smell struck him first. Not the acrid stench of rot, but something faint and stale, like a paper left too long in a basement, dust mixed with moisture. Inside lay a jumble of items that made his chest tighten. On top was a stack of photographs, old Polaroids, their edges curled, the colors fading. He lifted one carefully, brushing away flecks of dirt. The photo showed a group of children standing in front of a swing set. Their smiles were crooked, forced, their eyes shadowed. A few had braces. One boy held a small toy truck. But what unnerved David was not their expressions. It was the background. The swing set was unmistakable, the same one just across the park, unchanged even now except for a fresh coat of chipped paint. He set the picture down, hands tightening. Beneath the stack of photographs lay notebooks. Their covers were swollen from water damage, pages warped and mottled with black spots of mold. The first one he opened contained a child's handwriting, uneven, shaky letters scrawled in blue ink. The sentences were simple, fragmented. "We stayed here last night. He said we must be quiet. No one can hear us." Turning the pages, David found more unsettling lines. "I want to go home. I don't like the dark. He says the dog will bark if we make noise." He shut the notebook quickly, pulse hammering. Rex gave a low whine, shifting closer, his muzzle brushing the suitcase as if trying to sense more. Among the notebooks, something else caught his eye. A doll. It was small, no more than a foot long, its dress tattered and stained, one glass eye missing from its socket. The sight of it hit David harder than he expected. He remembered the doll his younger brother had given to their sister years ago, long before tragedy fractured his family. He brushed the thought away, focusing again. This doll had been left here for a reason. At the very bottom of the suitcase was an envelope. Unlike the other contents, the paper seemed surprisingly intact, though yellowed with time. He picked it up carefully, brushing away the clumps of dirt that clung to it. On the front, scrawled in uneven letters that shook with desperation, was a message. "If you are reading this, please save us." The handwriting was crude, likely a child's, the ink faded but still legible. His throat tightened. David looked around again. The elderly woman on the bench had left, the pigeons scattered, the path empty. A jogger passed by in the distance, earbuds in, oblivious to what had just been unearthed. Life in Ravenwood Park moved on as though nothing had changed. But for David, everything had. He placed the envelope gently back into the suitcase and closed the lid halfway, shielding its contents from prying eyes. His hand rested on Rex's head. The dog's ears remained alert, his gaze sharp and unyielding. David exhaled, knowing with certainty that this was no lost property, no forgotten relic. It was a cry for help that had waited, buried and silent, until a German shepherd's instincts had brought it to light. And the message inside was clear. Someone had wanted to be saved. David Miller placed the heavy suitcase on the worn oak table in his small kitchen, the sound of metal and wood colliding echoing too loudly for the quiet house. His home in Ravenwood was modest, a single-story bungalow built in the 1950s, its walls painted in muted shades of beige that had long since faded with time. The rooms smelled faintly of coffee grounds and the cedar polish he used once a month, a habit inherited from his father. A stack of police files sat neatly on the counter, reflecting his obsessive need for order. Yet tonight, as the autumn wind rattled the windows and rain tapped faintly against the glass, the suitcase in the center of the room made the house feel suddenly foreign, as if it didn't belong here. Rex patted across the wooden floor, nails clicking before settling near the table. The German shepherd's body was tense, tail curled close to his side, ears pointed toward the case as though it might move on its own. His amber eyes followed David's every motion. David reached down and gave him a reassuring pat, though his own pulse was anything but calm. Removing his gloves, David snapped on a desk lamp, its yellow light cutting across the table. He undid the latches again, the metal groaning in protest, and opened the suitcase. Inside, the same smell rose up: stale paper, mold, the faint sweetness of something long decayed. He pulled out the notebooks first, brushing dirt from their swollen covers, and laid them in a careful row. Then came the photographs, edges curled, children frozen in faded smiles against the backdrop of Ravenwood Park. The doll he placed last, its single-glass eye glinting in the lamplight. Finally, he reached for one of the notebooks. The first page carried a name: Emily Carter. The handwriting was that of a child, the letters large, uneven, pressed too hard into the paper. David began to read. Through her words, Emily seemed to step into the room with him. She described herself in ways only a child would. I am 12 years old. I am small. My hair is brown, and I wear it in 2 braids because my mom says it keeps me neat. My eyes are green like grass. He pictured her, slender, pale-skinned, with the awkward grace of a girl just stepping into adolescence. Her voice in the journal carried innocence and fear in equal measure. She wrote about her mother, a tall woman with auburn hair and freckles across her nose, who worked long hours at a local diner and always smelled of coffee and soap. Her father she mentioned rarely, only to say he looked angry even when he was not. David frowned, imagining a stern man in a pressed shirt, cigarette smoke clinging to his clothes, his sharp jaw set in stone. Emily confessed she was shy, afraid to speak up in class, but she loved to draw. In the margins of her entries were crude sketches: flowers, stars, once even a lopsided cat. On another page, she drew herself holding hands with her younger sister, whose hair was lighter, her smile wider. "She is not here," Emily wrote. "I hope she never comes here." The entries soon shifted. Her words trembled more, the letters rushed. She spoke of a man she never named. He said we were going to a house under the ground. He said no one would find us because the earth was too heavy. David's knuckles whitened as he gripped the paper. Another page. There are other kids. Mason likes trucks. Anna's hair is like corn. One boy never talks. We are told to be quiet. If we make noise, the walls will tell on us. Alongside the text was a drawing of a ladder leading down into darkness, with stick figures huddled below. David turned more pages, his stomach knotting. She wrote of a room with no windows, a ceiling that dripped water, a smell like metal and dirt. In one entry, she described scratching her name into a wall, only to be told not to. He said the walls listen. The last entry carried a date, September 2001. The letters were faint, smudged by dampness. If you find this, please tell my mom I didn't run away. I wanted to go home. The ground is too heavy here. David closed the notebook slowly, setting it down as if it might shatter. His throat felt dry, and the sound of rain outside grew louder in the silence of the room. Rex whined softly, rising to his feet and placing his front paws against the table, nose pressed near the notebook. His body trembled faintly, not in fear but in restless alertness, as though he too understood the weight of what was written. David looked at him, eyes narrowing. "You knew," he muttered. "Somehow you knew." The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a hammer. David sat back in his chair, staring at the name on the notebook, Emily Carter. The case files he had seen years ago came back to him. A missing girl from Ravenwood, age 12, presumed runaway. But she had not run. She had been taken, buried in a place described only as a house under the ground. And that place, Emily's words made chillingly clear, was beneath Ravenwood Park. The rain had slowed to a mist by the time David left his house. Midnight pressed its cold weight over Ravenwood, and the streets lay quiet except for the hiss of tires now and then on wet asphalt. The suitcase and its contents were locked in his trunk, but the notebook, Emily's notebook, rested in the inside pocket of his jacket. Every word seemed to thrum against his chest like a heartbeat. He couldn't shake the thought of the girl, 12 years old, scratching those desperate lines into the pages 2 decades earlier. Rex sat in the passenger seat, his large frame filling the space, ears forward and body stiff. The dog's silence was different tonight, not relaxed but coiled, as if he could sense they were on the edge of something. His amber eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, always scanning, never settling. David parked near the north entrance of Ravenwood Park, far from the playgrounds and jogging trails. Here the park was older, less maintained. Trees leaned crooked over cracked asphalt, and moss spread thick across wooden benches that no one had used in years. He clipped Rex's leash, but knew it would be useless if the dog decided to move. Rex wasn't reckless. He was deliberate. And tonight, David trusted that instinct. The forest swallowed them quickly, branches arching overhead to block what little moonlight filtered through. The smell of wet leaves mixed with the faint iron tang of rust. Rex stopped often, nose close to the ground, tail rigid, as though piecing together invisible breadcrumbs. David followed, sweeping his flashlight across the trees. They pushed deeper until Rex froze. His hackles rose, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Then he lunged forward, dragging David off the path and into a thicket. Vines clawed at their legs, wet leaves slapping against their faces. Finally, Rex stopped, pawing furiously at the ground beneath a wall of ivy. David crouched, pulling the vines aside. There, half buried under roots and leaves, was a rusted iron hatch. Circular, thick, with a handle corroded nearly smooth. Around its rim, faint carvings caught the beam of his flashlight. He brushed the grime away with his glove until the words emerged. "Silence keeps us safe." The letters were uneven, carved by hand, perhaps years ago, perhaps decades. David's breath clouded in the cold air. The phrase dug into him like a splinter. It was the same tone as Emily's writing, the same insistence that silence was survival. He pressed his palm against the hatch. The metal was cold, almost damp, as if it had been waiting. Rex whined sharply, pacing around the hatch, nose pressed low. The dog's muscles quivered with tension, his tail stiff, ears twitching as though he could hear something beneath them. David crouched lower, pressing his ear against the hatch, but there was nothing. No hum of machinery, no movement, just silence. Too deep, too deliberate. He sat back, scanning the clearing. Someone had tried to bury this. The vines were too thick, the soil too settled for it to be chance. Whoever had placed the hatch here had wanted it hidden. A noise startled him, branches snapping in the distance. David spun, hand on his flashlight, but only shadows shifted among the trees. Then a voice called out, low and uncertain, "Officer Miller?" A figure emerged from the path behind them, carrying a lantern instead of a flashlight. It was Margaret Holloway, one of the older residents of Ravenwood, known for walking the park even at odd hours. Margaret was in her late 60s, tall and thin, her shoulders hunched from age but her stride steady. She wore a long gray coat and boots caked with mud, and her silver hair was pinned back beneath a knit cap. Her face, sharp-boned and weathered, held a kind of stern kindness, a woman who had endured much and lost more. David had spoken to her once before on a noise complaint years back. She had told him then about her son, a young man lost to drugs, and how she had since lived alone, surviving on her pension and stubborn will. People in Ravenwood called her tough, sometimes cold, but David had seen the grief in her eyes that night, the kind that never left. "What are you doing out here, Mrs. Holloway?" David asked carefully. She glanced at Rex, still circling the hatch like a sentinel, then back at David. Her voice was rough, cracked from years of cigarettes. "I heard the dog," she said simply, "and I've lived in this town long enough to know when something isn't right." David hesitated, then shifted aside. The beam of her lantern caught the words on the hatch. Margaret's face went pale. She stepped closer, squinting, lips pressing thin. "I've seen this before," she whispered. David's heart quickened. "What do you mean?" Margaret leaned on her lantern as though it steadied her. "When I was a girl, back in the 70s, some of us used to sneak around this park. There was talk then. Stories about children who vanished, about a place under the ground. No one believed it. My father used to tell me, 'Keep quiet, Margaret. Silence keeps us safe.'" She shook her head, eyes glistening. "I thought it was just something he said to scare me. But now—" Her voice trailed off and she pulled her coat tighter against the chill. David crouched again, studying the carvings, the rust, the way the soil pressed around the hatch. He didn't know whether Margaret's memory was colored by fear or truth, but Emily's journal and the suitcase proved one thing. Someone had hidden children here. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint creak of branches. Rex pressed close to the hatch, ears forward, nose twitching, then let out a sharp bark that echoed through the clearing. The sound died quickly, swallowed by the night, leaving only silence. A silence that felt less like absence and more like warning. The iron hatch groaned as David wrenched the handle, flakes of rust breaking loose and drifting into the damp air. Margaret Holloway stood back, her lantern trembling faintly in her hand. Her sharp eyes followed every movement, but she said nothing, only drew her coat tighter around her shoulders. Rex pressed forward, paws scraping against the rim of the hatch, tail rigid. The dog's breathing was heavy, each exhale fogging in the cold night air. With a final heave, the hatch lifted. The hinges shrieked in protest, and a cloud of stale air rushed out, thick, metallic, with the sharp bite of mold. David gagged against it, pulling his collar higher. The smell was the kind that clung to skin, the kind that seemed older than memory. Beneath them, A narrow shaft descended into darkness. A ladder of iron rungs ran down the wall, slick with condensation. The beam of David's flashlight barely touched the bottom, revealing damp concrete and a passage that stretched beyond sight. Margaret whispered. Her voice cracked. "I told you. It was real." Her lantern's glow caught her face, and for the first time, David saw true fear there. Not just the weary grief of a woman who had lost too much, but the raw terror of recognition. "You should go home," David told her quietly. "This isn't safe." She hesitated, then gave a slow nod, retreating into the shadows of the forest path, her lantern bobbing until it disappeared. David clipped Rex's leash to his belt. "All right, partner. Let's see what's down there." The descent was treacherous. The rungs groaned under David's weight, slick with slime, each step threatening to slip from under his boots. Rex followed reluctantly, claws clicking against the metal, his body pressed close as if unwilling to leave David's side. The deeper they went, the thicker the air became, humid, stifling, filled with the stink of rust, mildew, and something else that lingered just out of recognition. At the bottom, their footsteps echoed across a narrow corridor. The walls were made of concrete but uneven, patched in places where the surface had cracked. Moisture dripped steadily from above, leaving streaks of dark mold that spread like veins. Pipes ran along the ceiling, some broken, hissing faintly. David swept his flashlight left and right. Doors lined the corridor, heavy metal doors, each one fitted with a narrow slot near the top, like something out of a prison or asylum. Most stood closed, their locks thick with corrosion, but even sealed, they radiated a sense of confinement. Rex sniffed along the ground, his nails clicking softly on the damp floor, tail stiff as a rod. David paused at the first door. He brushed dirt from the observation slot and peered inside. The beam of his flashlight revealed only shadows and peeling paint, but a smell seeped out. Musty, stale, with the faint sweetness of rot. He shut it quickly, jaw tightening. Farther down, a small chamber opened to the side. Unlike the other rooms, this one wasn't sealed. Its door hung ajar on broken hinges, leaning against the wall. David stepped inside cautiously. The room was bare except for a wooden table warped with water damage and a pile of objects scattered across it. He leaned closer, lifting one with his gloved hand. It was a cassette tape. The label was smeared, but faint numbers could still be read. 03. He picked up another. 04. The pile contained at least a dozen, all numbered, some cracked, some still intact. A battered tape recorder sat beside them, its plastic casing yellowed with age. David's pulse quickened as he slid one tape into the recorder. He pressed play. For a moment, only static hissed through the speaker. Then a sound emerged, faint but unmistakable, the voices of children. They were singing. The tune was simple, almost like a lullaby, but the way the voices wavered, broken and off-key, made David's skin crawl. The song carried no joy. It was monotone, forced, as though recited from memory under watchful eyes. He reached to stop the tape, but before he could, the children's voices faltered into whispers. Words emerged between the static, repeated by several voices. "Be quiet. Be still. Silence keeps us safe." Rex let out a sudden bark, sharp and loud, cutting through the air. He wasn't looking at the tape recorder. His body had pivoted, head lowered, ears pinned forward. He faced the far corner of the corridor, where a heavy iron door stood apart from the others. This one was thicker. its surface dented and scarred, as if someone had pounded on it from the inside. The lock was larger, newer than the others, bolted with industrial steel. Rex barked again, lunging against the leash, claws scraping furrows into the damp floor. His growls were low and furious, vibrating through the narrow hall. David raised his flashlight, beam landing on the door. Rust streaked down its frame, but the handle gleamed faintly, as if touched more recently than the others. His chest tightened. Whatever secrets lay behind that door, Rex knew, and he was demanding that David open it. The heavy door loomed before David, its metal scarred and pitted from years of contact. Rex stood rigid, his entire body focused on the door as though the very air behind it carried a scent no human could understand. His growls came in steady bursts, vibrating through the damp corridor, each bark a demand that David act. David tightened his grip on the flashlight and holstered it in the crook of his arm. He pulled from his belt a crowbar he had taken from his cruiser, the steel still slick from the drizzle outside. "All right, buddy," he muttered, bracing himself. "Let's see what's behind here." The first strike echoed through the underground like a gunshot. The crowbar bit into rust and metal, sparks spitting briefly in the dark. The door groaned, but it held. Sweat beaded on David's forehead despite the chill, his muscles straining with every slam. Rex barked furiously, leaping against the frame as if lending his strength. Finally, with a final wrench, the lock gave way. The sound was deafening, a metallic scream followed by the hollow clang of the bolt snapping. The door swung inward slowly, scraping against the wet floor. The smell that escaped was suffocating, damp, metallic, and something else, an odor of despair itself, stale air that had been trapped for years. David steadied himself, raised the flashlight, and stepped inside. The room was larger than he expected. The beam of light swept across walls covered in strange carvings, scratched words, symbols, names etched into the concrete with desperate force. Some were barely legible, others deep enough to gouge grooves. Among them, phrases repeated, "Be quiet," "Obey," "Silence keeps us safe." At the center of the room stood a chair. It was not ordinary. Heavy, iron, with restraints welded onto its arms and legs, the kind used not for rest but for control. Rust streaked down its frame, but the marks of use were undeniable. Scattered around the floor were remnants of children's belongings. A toy truck with one wheel missing, a doll's arm detached from its body, a set of crayons snapped in half. Each object whispered of its owner, once alive, once real, now only a trace in this underground tomb. Rex whined low, sniffing along the floor, his nose brushing against a small notebook tucked under the chair. David bent and picked it up. The cover was cracked, pages damp, but still intact enough to read. Inside was a list. Names, dozens of them, written in careful block letters. Next to each name was an age, a date, and in some cases a state abbreviation. Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, names from all across the Midwest. David's breath caught as he flipped further. The earliest entries dated back to the late 1980s, but then, toward the bottom, the handwriting grew clearer, fresher. The last names were no more than months old. Children had gone missing not decades ago, but recently. His heart thudded in his chest. This wasn't a legend, not an urban myth whispered in. Ravenwood. It was organized, deliberate, and still alive. A network. Rex barked suddenly, pawing at the far wall. David swung the flashlight, revealing more carvings. Among the chaos of scratches, one stood out, a crude drawing of a house underground beneath trees. Beside it, a name: Emily Carter. The letters jagged, desperate, carved deep into the wall as though Emily herself had fought to make her mark. David's throat tightened. He closed the notebook, shoving it inside his jacket. His hands shook, not from fear, but from rage. Whoever had built this place had left a trail of lives torn apart, a record hidden under Ravenwood Park. He turned back toward Rex, who stood with his ears forward, eyes fixed on the open door as if daring something unseen to emerge. David whispered to the dog, voice rough. "This isn't just one case, partner. It's a network." And now he knew he was standing in the heart of it. By dawn, the underground chamber was no longer a secret. David had called it in, his voice low and steady as he relayed what he had found, though his chest burned with rage. Within hours, Ravenwood Park swarmed with law enforcement. Squad cars lined the entrance, their red and blue lights flashing against the pale morning mist. Yellow tape wrapped around trees and fences. Reporters gathered at the periphery, their cameras raised like weapons, fighting for the best shot. Rex stayed close to David's side, the German shepherd's fur bristling as strangers poured in and out of the park. His ears twitched at the whine of generators powering floodlights, at the metallic groan of equipment as teams prepared to excavate more of the underground passage. David kept a steady hand on his partner's back, grounding himself in the animal's steady presence. Among the first federal agents to arrive was Lillian Reyes, an FBI investigator in her early 40s. She was tall, with the dark hair cut just below her shoulders, streaked faintly with gray. Her suit was practical rather than stylish, black slacks and a blazer wrinkled from travel, and her sharp brown eyes missed nothing. Years of handling child abduction cases had carved lines of fatigue into her face, yet her voice carried calm authority. She introduced herself to David with a firm handshake, her grip strong, her tone clipped. Reyes was direct. "We've suspected a network for years, Officer Miller. Scattered cases, children disappearing with no ransom, no bodies. This," she gestured toward the open hatch and the corridor below, "is the first physical proof we've had." David told her about the suitcase, about Emily Carter, about the journal and the list of names. Reyes listened without interruption, her jaw tightening with each detail. When he finished, she exhaled slowly. "You've uncovered more than a crime scene. You've uncovered a system." By noon, the story had spread beyond Ravenwood. Local stations interrupted broadcasts. Headlines scrolled across national networks. Underground chamber found in Ravenwood Park. Missing children cases reopened. Families began arriving from nearby towns, clutching photographs of lost sons and daughters. Some were young parents with haunted eyes. Others were older couples who had carried grief for decades. Their faces all bore the same question. Could their child's name be on the list David had found? That evening, the town gathered for a candlelight vigil at Ravenwood Park. The air was sharp with October cold, but hundreds came. They lined the paths and fields, candles flickering like stars against the night. Some prayed quietly, lips moving in silence. Others wept openly, their voices breaking as they called out names into the dark. David stood near the oak tree at the center of the park, the same tree children once played under, now a symbol of mourning and hope. Rex sat beside him, calm but watchful, his amber eyes reflecting the candlelight families approached them one by one. Mothers knelt to stroke Rex's fur, tears falling into his thick coat. Fathers clutched David's hand, their grips desperate, as if holding on to him might anchor them to hope. An older woman pressed a photograph into David's hand. Her daughter had vanished in 1995. She was small, with blonde curls and a missing front tooth, frozen forever in a school portrait. David promised her quietly that the list would be checked, every name traced. The woman nodded, her face etched with gratitude and grief. Rex became the center of it all. Children who still remained in Ravenwood crowded around him, their tiny hands resting on his head, their voices whispering thanks, though they did not fully understand. To them, he was more than a police dog. He was a savior, a guardian who had unearthed what everyone else had ignored. The vigil stretched long into the night. Candles guttered in the cold wind, but people relit them, refusing to let the flames die. A local pastor offered prayers, his voice trembling as he spoke of light in darkness, of truth rising from the ground itself. David looked down at Rex, the dog's ears twitching, his breathing steady. He felt the weight of what they had uncovered, the horror of the chamber, the names in the notebook, but also the fragile hope it sparked. They had opened a wound, yes, but one that had to bleed before it could heal. He leaned closer to Rex, whispering into the dog's ear, words meant only for him. "You didn't just find a suitcase, partner. You found the truth this city forgot." Rex's amber eyes lifted to meet his, and for a moment, man and dog stood together in silence, guardians of a secret that had finally come to light. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or lightning, but with a quiet bark in the grass, a paw pressing against the earth, and a truth that refuses to stay buried. Rex's discovery in Ravenwood Park was more than instinct. It was a reminder that God often works through the most unlikely messengers, even a faithful German shepherd. In our daily lives, we all walk past hidden struggles. A neighbor behind closed doors, a child who smiles but carries silent pain, an elderly soul who longs to be heard. This story reminds us, silence is not safety, and compassion is not weakness. When we choose to listen, to see, to care, we become part of the miracle. So tonight, as you reflect on this tale, may you remember that God's light shines even in the darkest tunnels. May He guide you to notice the unseen, to protect the vulnerable, and to hold fast to hope. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so you never miss another journey of faith, courage, and love. And may God bless you and your family, today and always.